Namaste. Continuing our journey into the joy of suffering, our deeper entry today will be into the more elusive and esoteric realms of the area. Our guide in the journey will be psychoanalysis consultant Mr. Himanshu Vaidya. Namaste.
Namaste.
Mr. Vaidya, how does the joy of suffering work out in a fused relationships?
Those relationships are at the root of many problems, including most of personality disorders. We can see fused relationships in the external world, and there are fused relationships in the internal world. In the external world, the fused relationships are of a flavor where the person says to, by and large, a parent or some person to whom this person is fused with, now it is only you and me and no one else. And in suffering, we are together and we are one. So two individuals fuse together, and the patient, who is the dependent, in that dyad, he actually goes from a state of happiness to a state of suffering so that he can become one with the mother or the father or some authority figure, some parent figure who he thinks is suffering, and therefore becomes one with that person so that he can become close and one in that state of suffering. So one goes from a normal state, a healthy state, a happy state, down to the state of suffering for becoming one with that person. Because the patient believes that if he continues to be happy, he can't be one with the person with whom he wants to fuse. And that will be loss and abandonment. So in order to prevent loss and abandonment, he reduces himself from a state of happiness to a state of gloom and suffering. It is like a self-invited, self-created depression in order to prevent object loss. In this dyad then, even when we point out to the person what is happening, there is a joy of suffering. Because apart from the suffering that has been self-created for achieving the object relation, there is an ecstasy of the object relation. There is a security of the object relation. There is a comfort level in that object relation. And very importantly, which most people miss, there is a loyalty, a sense of responsibility, and an admiration of the superego, which is intoxicating in that object relation. So even though that object relation takes you into a state of gloom, it makes you move away from happiness. It practically destroys your career. It creates a situation where you are related only to that person and to no one else. And no one matters. And in these cases, most of the time, the patient is attached only to that one person with whom he is fused. He has half relationships with other family members where he has grown up, and after that he does not actually attach to anybody in the real sense. Not even to the husband, to the children, to the in-laws, to the friends, to the teachers. Practically speaking, in a deeper sense, he does not attach to anybody in this world in a deeper sense. Except for that fused relationship and the joy and the suffering and the joy of suffering, the person refuses to relate to anybody else in the real deeper sense of the term. So this is what happens internally. This state, when it goes very intense, then it acquires various flavors. If the closeness becomes too much, then the fear of annihilation anxiety, the fear of self-disintegration starts. If the objects representations of other objects are deactivated for a very long time, then fantasy objects in that fusion starts emerging with high force and intensity, because the objects representing others in the world are decathected, and the entire cathexis is put on fantasy objects. Then this fused state starts resembling slowly the early oceanic state of primary narcissism, where slowly, while you are in the dyadic fusion, that state of dyadic fusion starts having elements of the primary narcissism and the gestalt of the early years. And in that state, although it is not exactly that state, but the flavor of that state comes, and in that state, with some flavor of primary narcissism, uh, the objects which are moving around in the psyche are objects which are highly toned with affect and not attenuated in any way. So extremely good, extremely bad objects are moving about in the psyche, because the whole world is practically decathected, and the decathexis, the energy, the libido which is withdrawn from the rest of the world representations is now put on the fantasy objects of early life, and some of them are created anew. This is where the person often stops, because the person is terrified of any further fusion. And even in fusion, there is an optimum distance.
Okay.
I am not talking about a psychotic fusion, but in personality disorders and all other forms of neurotic fusions, there is an optimum distance even in that fused state.
Okay.
The difficulty then is the person is not able to relate to any other person with clear boundaries. He knows only to relate with fusion. So he knows only to relate with the joy of suffering. He is not ready to relate to anybody without that joy of suffering. So this is one way the joy of suffering works out in the context of fusion. The second way it works out in the internal world is by fusion with the dead mother or the unavailable mother. When that happens, two things happen. If the person has a healthy constitution or later experiences which are healthy, then even though that fusion with the dead mother or the absent mother happens internally, which is quite different from a real life external fusion that we were talking about a few moments back. In that internal state, if the constitution or good experiences are enough, the person uses a reaction formation and uses manic denial as a defense. So while internally at the depth, there is a fusion with the dead mother, the unavailable mother, the half-sad mother, the absent mother. On the surface, the person feels slightly high and effervescence. And the manic defense is quite different from mania. Mania has to come crashing down very soon. It cannot endure for long. But the manic defense can endure for the whole of your life. So it's a long-term high. It's almost a permanent high. And that permanent high also becomes one positive reason for not healing yourself and not visiting that core of depression. And one continues with the joy on the surface and suffering inside.
Right.
In another case, something opposite happens. One is fused with the person and one goes into the Oedipus, and the Oedipus acquires a strange fused kind of a form where the Oedipus has a very strong flavor of the pre-Oedipal fusion, because the child never had a normal separation individuation process. So now what happens is the pleasure is trapped in that fusion and in the Oedipus, and outside what comes out is anxiety and anger,
Right.
which is opposite of what we saw the first time.
Hmm.
That when the reaction formation is used and manic denial is used,
Hmm.
there is pleasure in the conscious and sadness in the unconscious. Here you have pleasure in the unconscious and anxiety and anger in the conscious.
Right.
Or we can have uh, the pleasure getting trapped inside and sadness coming out because of the loss of the object in that triangle. So these are the internal states where the fusion is related to the joy of suffering. And in all these situations, one is not able to give up the state of joy of suffering because of various reasons. One, the joy itself. Two, the fear of any new state because you don't have practice of anything else. Three, the fear of abandonment. Fourth, one is comfortable with that tragic holding state. And fifth, there is some part which is sanctioned by the superego, and there is superego admiration. So this is the pathological way of fusion related to the joy of suffering. Now we come to the more obvious ways. Take for example the situation of idealism, where you sacrifice something for somebody you love. So there is this joy of suffering because of doing something which is ideal. Then there is a state of masochism, the joy of suffering because you want to fuse with somebody and in that fusion be beaten up. So there is actually a coming together of masochism and fusion, and out of that a joy of suffering comes. So the joy there is not only of masochism but also of fusion. And then there is the fusion of the individual not inside or outside with a person but with a larger cause. For example, with a nation or an ideology. And one is able to sacrifice everything for that sake. And there is a joy of suffering for that cause with which one is fused. Now, one of the very important elements of fusion is this. Fusion gives you intensity, authenticity, belongingness, loyalty, and security, which a two-person relationship with healthy boundaries can never give you.
Right.
So when we say that we are dealing with somebody in a healthy state with very clearly laid down boundaries, this is a very utilitarian and a very Western concept and psychoanalytic concept. It is not a universally accepted concept. Many people feel.
Does that mean that there is the kind of fusion with omnipotence?
Yeah.
Which can provide everything.
So psychoanalysis does not like that, but that does not mean everyone does not like that. Psychoanalysis does not approve of it as healthy. That does not mean everyone agrees with it. Because the relationship between two people with clearly laid down boundaries and an adult way of relating to the other can never give you the intensity, the authenticity, the security, the belongingness, and the loyalty, right, as intense and as authentic as a fused relationship happens. So there what we are looking at is, in early life we are fused, then we separate, and then we dare not fuse because the fusion reminds us of difficulties of early life fusion. But there is something which is called fusion with mastery. That you fuse in early childhood, you separate as an adult, then you realize that I can actually have best of both the worlds. I can have boundaries when I want, and I can have intensity and authenticity and the loyalty when I want in a fused relationship. The only difficulty is I have to be very clear with whom to fuse, how much to fuse, how to fuse, and be ready if anything goes wrong to handle the outcomes of a fusion approach. So that requires quite an element of self-development, self-work, and self-mastery. And we see very productive fusion in the real world, which is based on compatibility, which does good to both individuals who fuse and also to the world at large. Take for example the pairs of Kalyanji Anandji or Lakshmikant Pyarelal, or many many musicians who are able to have a very healthy fusion which endures a lifetime, and in that collaboration such creative output happens which is not possible otherwise. And we also see that when one of the two dies, right, the other person is not able to produce much. He is not able to get along with any other partner and fill up that position. So these are examples of very creative, very healthy situations of fusion, which are quite distinct from those instances of fusion where the joy of suffering manifests itself. Here you have celebration and joy, not the joy of suffering.
When you were talking about this conscious level of suffering and pleasure in it, and the unconscious level, the different versions of it, is there a possibility of catharting out and then living it? Like, can we say that can the joy of suffering be an indirect catharsis one gives to oneself?
Yeah, very much so. If we look into history, the joy of suffering, the joy after suffering, the necessity of going into suffering, all of that was very clearly recognized. This idea that we should always be in a state of pleasure and avoid pain is a very recent modern and psychoanalytic idea. Although psychoanalysis at least has an exception compared to classical modernity, that we do realize that we have to go through short-term pain for long-term gain in the process of therapy. But otherwise, it's a very recent and modern idea. If you look at the ancient civilization of the Greeks, the prime function of art in the Greek civilization was for tragedy and catharsis.
Okay.
And the prime element of art, therefore, in the Greek civilization was drama. Because drama is something where catharsis can be done at the deepest and the widest levels. In Eastern cultures also, there was a very clear idea about the value of catharsis, the pricelessness of catharsis, the pricelessness of joy of suffering. That there is joy in suffering if we can train ourselves for it. And there is immense joy after suffering when catharsis has happened. And we are very light, we are empty, and we are free. The system is emotionally detoxed. So we see in India the play of Ramayana and Mahabharata. That drama was played out every year on fixed months, on fixed weeks, where the community would collect together like in ancient Greece. The only thing was the drama was different. Where Mahabharata and Ramayana were played out, local versions, vernacular versions of the two were played out. The same Ramayana and Mahabharata were told and retold with minor variations to account for local experiences and local necessity for experiences.
Right.
And we had folk art. Folk art, the folklore was also played out. Not only that, there are in the Indian folk tradition certain communities whose full-time job is to play those folk arts and make people cry. So there is almost a community, a small community devoted to catharsis of society.
Hmm.
And their job is to keep innovating more and more cathartic artistic elements and songs. And
Yeah,
this
in
as
many of traditions and rituals, we have songs like that of separation from parents of the bride. We have
yeah,
songs for that. We have rudalis who
right,
know how to, process the pain of grief of losing your loved ones.
right.
So yes,
So the Rudalis are the folk counterparts of emotion-centered therapists.
right,
So they have their own setup. They create their own setup, their frame. They create that state, and in that state they use their tools. So, like any form of therapy, this is a social form of a cathartic therapy. And here we see two elements. One, people joyfully go into the suffering. Even while they are undergoing the suffering by identification, there is a secret joy of that suffering.
right.
Part masochism, part superego happiness, part the joy of getting healthy, part the joy of the death instinct, part the joy of uh, identification and living out the aggression, and part the uh, the 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 joy of a spiritual or a mystical type of self development as one is entering the deeper and difficult parts of oneself. All those joys are together along with suffering, constituting this whole joy of suffering, and an immense joy after that suffering is over and after one is light and detoxed. So we see how the joy of suffering entangles with art and folklore.
Also, what I feel sometimes there's another joy of creating a safe anticipatory future response to problems in seeing by projection and identification. I've seen many people doing this. They live out the pleasure, the joy of suffering by these pieces, and when they have their own share of real effect of the worldly challenge, they are very immune to it by that time.
Right.
So
So
that means a lot of gratification of this desire has been taken place during these kind of repeated exposures.
there are two kinds of repetitions. One
Mhm.
is repetition for rehearsal, so that you are prepared
Mhm.
for what is to come. And second is
What is to come?
repetition of what has already happened,
Right,
which is gradual desensitization.
right, right.
Right. So uh, both elements we see in folklore, in even cultural religious practices.
Hmm.
For example, people wait. I have seen people waiting to actually come to that stage where certain songs which would induce suffering would be sung.
Right.
And people are joyfully waiting for that suffering. It's not unusual for
Are we still connected?
yeah, we are connected. It is not unusual for people to even wait long time for entering the state of suffering,
Hmm.
which is quite distinct from popular belief that we are only animals of pleasure and we want to avoid pain at every cost, which is in general true. But there is also this part of us, a minor part of us, of course, a hidden part of us, which is not exactly the pleasure seeking type. And there the definitions of what is pleasure, what is pain, is happiness in both, or have we to look at happiness through pleasure, happiness through pain? Do we need that kind of a triangular construction? And a very different conceptualization of uh, pain converting to happiness, happiness converting to pain, uh, the unconscious feeling pleasure out of what is painful for the conscious. Those complications arise at the deeper levels of our mind, and more difficult and elusive operations as they take place there.
True. So when we're talking about different civilizations, cultures, and religions, they have, inculcated these special kind of rituals or ceremonies or festivals where we can process all of these in to some extent, uh, catharting out or living it out by identification and projection. So can we say that really do festivals leverage the joy of suffering? Because it is a time for celebration. So what are we celebrating about?
Uh, the world of festivals and their psychoanalytic analysis is a world of its own. It's a very large world. It also brings us to the idea of, should we be modifying the way we celebrate festivals, or should we be creating and designing new festivals to cater to our present needs? And that would be psychoanalytically designing festivals.
Right.
So this is a very interesting area. But coming to what is already there, uh, we see a few types of festivals where the joy of suffering is leveraged or engaged with. Take for example a few examples. Uh, Muharram celebrated by uh, people in Iran and in other parts of the world also, where they joyfully give suffering to themselves. And it almost becomes like, apart from atonement and spiritual purification, it also releases cathartically many other elements also, which are strictly individual and subjective to the person. Take the second example of shamanic practices, some of which include giving pain to oneself in the frenzy of a festival, which might include beating up oneself or poking oneself with some iron elements, or walking on coals, burning coals. And these are very well documented festivals where people sort of undergo the joy of suffering, that they know they are going to suffer. But if you hold them back and ask them not to do it, they will fight with you to do it. Right? So it's a strange kind of a combination of joy and pain, pleasure and pain. And we see there the joy of suffering in that shamanic context. In Indian context, we see, for example, the Sikh community, they observe this mercy for the sufferings their ancestors have undergone. Many people observe some tragic festivals where something has happened, and they observe it as a fast or as a mourning day. So death days of many saints are observed in that way.
Yes.
You also see absences that something should be there and is not there. For example, India and the Hindu community particularly very badly needs a mourning festival to mourn the Hindu Holocaust, which is a 1,000-year-old Holocaust and is still going on. But we have neither recognized that nor put it into our culture as a mourning festival. We need that festival where we undergo that joy of suffering. So we also
I
have
think for
instance.
martyrs' days, we are kind of, inculcating in our culture by like Shahid Bhagat Singh's Martyrs' Day, then Kargil War. It to good extent, it is being, started, initiated
It
in
is
some ways.
episode based. We are not
Episode.
connecting the episodes. For example,
Hmm.
the genocide of Kashmiri Pandits is one episode.
Right.
The Mopla massacre of Hindus is another episode.
Right.
The Bengal massacre, another episode. Jallianwala Bagh, another episode. Massacre by Aurangzeb, another episode. Ibrahim Lodi, Taimur, uh, Khilji. There is a series.
Mhm.
So the genocide of Sikhs, the genocide of Rajputs, the genocide of Marathas by Abdali. So if you put together all these genocides of Hindus, these are episodes. The episodes are so large, so inhuman and so brutal that to an outsider it looks as though this itself is a Holocaust.
Holocaust. Right.
But actually, if you put all of them together, you will see they all form instances in a larger procession of the Hindu Holocaust, which is almost like a super Holocaust, which is still going on. And we need to recognize and put in a festival and have this joy of suffering built into that festival. So this is one of the ways in which the joy of suffering engages with culture, with civilization, and with festivals.
Very delicately woven around. That too with the flip side, joy of suffering. Um, when we talk about great superhuman like personalities like Jesus, Mansoor, Al-Halaj, we see the joy of suffering in extremes. How do we understand that?
Uh, there are various combinations. There can be joy in suffering, where we are dealing with issues like fusion, object relations, idealism, loyalty, issues of this type. Then there can be joy of suffering where we are dealing with masochism and death instinct. And there is joy despite suffering. So the two are together, no doubt about it. And there is a joy of suffering because one is not escaping suffering, although one can escape. One decides not to escape.
Hmm.
And while one is suffering, one is also in joy. So there is a joy of suffering. But this is a different type. This is joy despite suffering. This is joy free from suffering.
Hmm.
So there is a very special element of spiritual freedom and spiritual purpose when we talk of these instances of joy of suffering, when we refer to Mansoor and we refer to Christ. So in their cases, there is a fountain of joy and light, almost a perpetual healthy mania. Let me not use the word mania, it has connotations, but let me say a healthy ecstasy.
Hmm.
And there is a causeless bliss, a causeless ecstasy, and a very intense causeless bliss and ecstasy. Now that is all ongoing all the time, because it is causeless. Now, when you have this healthy, causeless ecstasy and bliss going on, and a suffering arises parallel, the suffering is not able to exhaust or annihilate this causeless ecstasy and bliss. And this is where we see that even when the worst of physical brutalities were perpetuated on them, their joyful state was still intact. And this is a very special kind of joy of suffering. Then it does fall under the definition of joy of suffering, because they were suffering for a purpose. They were suffering to the call of their purpose of life. They were suffering to the cause of their self journey and journey of the universe. And they are plugged into it, playing a certain role. But from a psychological standpoint, we see that they had reached a level where the ecstasy and bliss, which are causeless, was very intense and far more than the intensity of suffering ever could be. So that is where they were able to take so much of even physical suffering without being dethroned from the state of ecstasy and bliss. So we see this there, and this also brings us to their special compassion and sensitivity, apart from their evolution and their role in evolution. But we can take up the empathy and sensitivity in the next part. But coming back to this part, there is something which is called, there is a title given by somebody else. I think it is Pir Inayat Khan. It is called the Rapture of the Being. And Sri Aurobindo calls it the rapture in the nerves, the rapture in the bones. That also is an element of their state. Apart from the ecstasy and bliss, this rapture feeling, a very strong feeling of rapture in the whole body, which cannot be overthrown or overwhelmed by the pain. So that state of joy of suffering is very different. The state of Mansoor or Jesus is very different. You can also look at a similar state of many of the Sikh gurus who were tortured.
Right.
That they were able to bear it and not succumb, because the rapture, the ecstasy, the strength of idealism and purpose, and the bliss, they constituted such a solid pillar of celebration, even in that torturous state, that the torturous state was not able to intrude and overwhelm that state of celebration. So we are dealing here with a very different situation of the joy of suffering than what we find in ordinary situations.
One of the famous poets, Virgil, writes in his poetry, "The touch of tears in mortal things, does it take the joy of suffering to superhuman context?"
Yes, it does, because when Virgil says a touch of tears in mortal things, uh, there are two elements into it. One is the element of celebration and ecstasy just by virtue of existing, and an element of tears and tragedy, because the existence is mortal and the existence is imperfect. The existence is not where we wish to be. So we are frail, we are fragile, we are imperfect, we are far from what we want to be. And that is true for the whole of existence. The whole of existence is far from what it would like to be. And this lack of fulfillment, this powerlessness and helplessness, this tragic state of being where one is and not being able to do anything to change the outside world, and seeing what is in the outside world. So being witness and helpless in the face of suffering of self and the others, and not having a sense of fulfillment for self or the others. This brings the element of touch of tears. So we see both of it, that a touch of ecstasy of existing and a touch of tears because one is not what one would like to be. And one sees the tragedy for oneself and for others and the helplessness and powerlessness in the face of it. And the I would call it a divine impatience at the state of affairs and not being ready to reconcile with reality acceptance. One of those areas where reality acceptance is a sin, contrary to psychoanalysis. So this is where the joy of suffering is there in the eyes of the poet, not only as a human phenomena in human mind, but even in existence, there is a joy of suffering, and this takes the concept into a suprahuman realm.
Mr. Vedya, when we are talking about these tears, we have seen there people who have tears of, empathy. They have a certain level of sensitivity to compassion towards other people's pain. So can empathy, sensitivity, or compassion lead to the joy of suffering? Is it the same joy we are referring to?
It can lead to the joy of suffering in a slightly different way. Uh, sensitivity leads to two things. One is to feeling what the other feels, suffers, and one adopts that suffering in a way, partially for a purpose, but one adopts that suffering, which is actually outside. You did not adopt it.
Outside.
It's not a compulsion, but you adopt it, partially or completely. And even as one identifies with the person, one recreates in oneself the state of the person. There is also a joy which accompanies that suffering, because the superego knows it is doing something right, that the person is doing something right. If you believe in soul, the soul also realizes that at last what ought to be done is being done. So this compassion, sensitivity, empathy, they all lead to both joys of the three. There is a joy of empathy, a joy of sensitivity, a joy of compassion. And at the same time, the three also bring in an element of suffering. Suffering, which is recreation of the state for whom we are feeling these things. And the suffering of our helplessness of not being able to eradicate these things.
Right.
And also a suffering of our not being resourceful enough to do all that we wish to do. So all the three bring about two things. At times, it is the tears and joy of helplessness and the desire to help. That one is psychologically one with somebody, that gives you joy. One wishes to do something good, that gives you joy. The other person has you, that gives you joy. He is no longer alone the moment you are compassionate. So that gives you joy. But your lack of resources, your lack of power, your helplessness, and your even greater helplessness in eradicating root of this problem, that brings an element of helplessness. One instance of joy of suffering because of these three in a tragic situation. On the contrary, in more happy situations, the joy of suffering can also be because of the joy of tears or the joys of voluntary separations, or the joy of voluntary communion with somebody who is advancing rapidly and therefore is moving away from us.
Mm-hmm.
So there is this situations of ambivalence where one wishes well for somebody and one wishes that he goes on to his journey. At the same time, one experiences a loss.
Very true.
Similarly, one looks at something very happy and celebratory, and from a distance, because of high sensitivity and compassion, one wishes good, but one is into tears because of either one's own past or one's own tragedies, or one not been able to do this to many other people. And that is a separate instance where these three entities lead you to the joy of suffering, where both of them are there. But this is a very noble context of the joy of suffering, quite apart from the sadomasochistic context which we have.
Very true. So when you talk about the psychoanalytical viewpoint of this joy of suffering, where we know that fusion takes place, the pleasure of superego takes place, a lot of internalization, projection, then we talked about these so-called beautiful humanity-based noble emotions like that of empathy and compassion. What goal it serves in the journey of one's being in spiritual path?
Rightly, you summarized it that we see the joy of suffering in the pathological context, in the normal context, and in the supernormal context. Now, in the spiritual path, the joy of suffering takes a different flavor. One flavor is the flavor of atonement. In Sanskrit, there is a better word for it, prayashchit.
Right.
So one puts oneself to suffer for atonement, and that purifies oneself and takes off the karmic burden. The second is one punishes oneself joyfully in order to change one's thoughts and behaviors so one does not make the mistake again, which is more of a moral training of a person. The third is the acceptance of existence without any question, a state of complete surrender. That even when the suffering comes, one tries to preserve as much as possible the joyful situation and accept it as joyfully as possible. That it may be coming for a purpose higher than what we can think about. But it is for a purpose, and we joyfully participate in that purpose. One joy of suffering approach can be that we are training ourselves so that the observer status is not disturbed no matter how much suffering comes. And the more we are able to maintain the observer status, the more joyful we feel. So both of them are together. Whenever suffering comes, we try to maintain the observer status, and the joy comes from succeeding in maintaining as much as we can. Another element of joy of suffering comes when we are able to transform it completely. But this is not everyone's cup of tea.
True.
Because Sri Aurobindo says that he went into certain states where he could feel that pain is nothing more than condensed form of pleasure. That all that appears as pain is actually a condensed form of pleasure. Pleasure so great that we are not able to bear it. So then, in that situation, that state of self-development, there is no pleasure and pain. There is pleasure and greater pleasure. because you see pain itself as a condensed form of pleasure. But that is not everyone's cup of tea. So these are some of the ways in which spirituality engages with the joy of suffering. There is also a concept of the day and night of yoga.
Okay, what's
That on the path of self-development and self-exploration, the good and the bad states, they oscillate one after another. For 4 or 5 days, you make very good progress intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, and then for 2 days you go on a low. You make mistakes,
okay?
you are not able to think clearly, things are not happening as you wish, tragedies come from outside,
Hmm.
and then again the day starts after some time. So there is a sort of a spiritual bipolarity, right? Not the DSM bipolarity, but just to say, poetically speaking,
To experience.
yeah,
Hmm.
it is called the day and night on the yogic path, the spiritual path.
Okay. Okay.
And there the joy of suffering makes an appearance, because one has to train oneself that when the night starts, we should be able to preserve our joy as much as possible till we are able to completely transform night into day. That is the idea. That is the goal. So these are some of the ways in which spirituality engages with this joy of suffering. But one important element is this, that in spirituality it is very clear, certain things are very clear. One, the joy is more than suffering. Two, suffering is because of our own lack of self-development and our own past karma. Very little suffering is because of something inevitable outside of us, outside of our karma.
Hmm.
And the third, the suffering is for a purpose. And fourth, the goal is very clear. The goal is celebration. The goal is not suffering. So mastery on the self, mastery on the world as much as possible, mastery on the laws of nature, ultimately towards celebration. So the joy of suffering is a transitional state towards a state of mastery and celebration.
Right. We talked about the spiritual viewpoint to joy of suffering. We have so many dramas written, as we discussed earlier, so many poetry, so many songs written where humans have, catharted out their hearts out, their emotions out. So beyond the artwork, okay, how can the joy of suffering and suffering itself be seen in the philosophical context? Because this entire discussion seems to be very philosophical because it varies individual to individual. Though at the basic level, the recipe of emotions remains the same, but how variable it is in putting it out on the canvas of life. So, what is the philosophical context of this joy of suffering?
Philosophically, we look at it in two ways: an ontological way, a historical way, and an evolutionary way. Three things, three ways actually.
Okay.
If we look at it from a pure ontological point of view, the we come to a position where we ask the question, why does suffering exist in the first place?
Hmm.
Why should joy of suffering also exist in the first place? Why should there not be pure joy? Why should joy of suffering exist in the first place?
Right.
And their critics of God talk about God being the sadist. That if God wanted, why could he not create a universe without suffering or joy of suffering and only joy?
True.
Who is to answer a question like this? Nobody has a question to answer to this question. And people put up lame defenses instead of accepting the fact that we don't have an answer to this question. The best answer possible is that the that God is immanent. God is immanent. So he has become everything. So when you are suffering, he is also suffering. So he has not created suffering and been away from it. He himself is experiencing suffering through you and through many other people. So he is not a sadist. So then the question comes, then he is a masochist. Because why does he like to experience suffering through us? Why can't he create a universe where there is no suffering? So the first ontological philosophical approach to this question is, why does suffering and therefore the joy of suffering even should exist? And the only answer is that we don't have an answer, but what we realize from our life is that the principle of nature or God, whatever you call, based on your belief system, that ultimate entity wanted to create it and has created it, and so it is. So God loves drama, God loves sadism, God loves masochism. All the entities that have stood the test of evolution are the elements that God loves. And therefore God has also created the unconscious mind in a way which has a dramatist inside of it. Our unconscious mind has a dramatist inside of it. We all have a Shakespeare inside of us.
True.
That we may not be able to create anything. That Shakespeare may be creating only intrapsychic dramas, but we all have intrapsychic dramas created all the time inside of us. And we are all melodramatic in our unconscious mind. So there is a dramatist in all of us. And why there should be suffering, joy of suffering in the world and inside of us is an ontological question. And the only answer is, this is the way God wanted this creation to be, and to experience it in a way by immanence. This is one philosophical argument from an ontological standpoint. From a historical standpoint, philosophy looks at the history and the ontological and the real life status of suffering and the joy of suffering. That over the historical period, has the suffering and the joy of suffering increased or reduced? And are we going to some goal, or is history always going to be in this state? And most people answer it to say that suffering and the joy of suffering has reduced over the historical evolution, and therefore there seems to be some linear element to history, even if there is also a cyclical element to history, and the both put together create a upwardly moving spiral of history. So there is a linearity to history, there is a cyclicity to history, and both put together creates an upward moving spiral of history. So there is spiral movement, that after 100 years of good times, you have a world war or you have some catastrophic event, and you again go down and huge amount of suffering comes, and we have no choice but to endure or go for the joy of suffering, because pure joys may not be possible. So in that upwardly moving spiral, we have a reduced need, necessity, and existence of the suffering and the joy of suffering, and an increasing quantum of joy. And the suffering itself takes various different forms. The joy of suffering takes far more benign and harmless forms. So there can be a joy of suffering of loneliness, and there can be a joy of suffering in physically suffering for a cause. And obviously the joy of suffering in loneliness is a far more benign and harmless form. So this is the process view of history from a philosophical standpoint, that some people philosophically view it as a constant thing, as a linear thing, not a linear thing, but a constant thing, that the suffering and the joy of suffering does not change much. But most people believe it's an upwardly moving spiral. Suffering, joy of suffering are reducing. They are taking more benign and harmless forms. And Then we have a, a teleological and a historical view of the entire universe, a largest view of philosophy possible, and that tells us that perhaps this entire procession of existence from beginning to the end has a purpose in which events have to happen and certain elements have to undergo manifestation and evolution, and suffering is one of those elements, and the joy of suffering also is one of those elements. That a certain form of suffering has to be processed in this life cycle of the universe, a certain amount of anger has to be processed, a certain quantum of curiosity has to be processed, a certain quantum of bliss has to be processed, a certain quantum of ecstasy has to be processed. So all these elements have to undergo manifestation and being experienced by sentient beings in this process of universe. And in that context, the joy of suffering is also one such evolutionary entity which is undergoing its own evolution. And in that evolution, there are two elements. One, the change it undergoes over time. And second, how it gets experienced, felt, and processed out by being felt by very sentient beings. And maybe even non-sentient existence, we don't know. So this is how philosophy looks at the the evolutionary necessity and the significance and the inevitability of the joy of suffering. It is there de trop, and it is in process and will reach its goal. And in that goal, when it reaches, we will be free from it.
Amazing discussion today we had with Mr. Vedya. It's like a 360-degree view given by, shared by you, of joy of suffering, right from the individual joy of suffering to the collective joy of suffering, right from the pathological viewpoint of joy of suffering to the spiritual context of the purpose of life and existence itself. So joy of suffering has been a joyful journey today with you. And for all our viewers, do write to us at hvindia@gmail.com. Namaste.
Namaste.